Second Timothy chapter 3. We're at a snail's pace. We're crawling through verse 10 and we're almost ready for verse 11. You, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance. We talked about those things. One of the aspects of endurance, which I do not like very much, I want to have a very high level of endurance. But in order to get endurance, this is very similar to patience. In order to get both patience and endurance, which are closely connected, I mean, they're not the same thing, but they are so much alike. Anyway, in order to get either or both of those, you're going to have to go through bad stuff. Things that test you, things you don't like, things that aren't fair. In other words, life. I wish it were different. I wish this was not so. I wish there were just a few exercises or maybe even more than a few, but it doesn't work that way. To gain endurance, to gain patience, you're going to go through trial. And that's what Paul says next in verse 11. Persecutions, sufferings, what kinds of things happened to me in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, the persecutions I endured. Those are the things that produced patience and endurance in him. And here's the other part, in my opinion. They're the things that demonstrate his patience and endurance. Sufferings, persecutions. We just simply we don't have the experience of persecution. We have the experience of inconvenience. We have, as I'm recording this, big in my experience is inflation and the correction of the stock market, which is knocking, it's knocking my retirement funds where I probably don't have retirement funds. But that's not persecution. In our experience, in the world we live in, we have plenty of bad things that happen. But we're not yet experiencing persecution. I'm grateful for this, and I'm hopeful that my kids and my grandkids will not experience persecution because of their faith. I have no guarantee of this. There are a lot of people who they think they have biblical evidence and imperative for the fact that, we are God's chosen ones and he will protect us. Well, that didn't work out for Paul. Persecutions, and his persecutions involve suffering, as do the persecutions of the church in China, in much of the Middle East, in other places in Asia and Asia Minor. More people are losing their lives because of their faith today than ever before in history. If you are interested in more information about what's happening around the world to God's people, let me just suggest you get your computer set up to go on your web browser and type in Voice of the Martyrs. It's an organization who are based here in Oklahoma, who they monitor, they accumulate and acquire facts about what's going on in the world with regard to the persecution of God's church. It's pretty breathtaking. We're isolated from it because frankly, our media is totally unconcerned with that. It won't sell advertising, so they're pretty much, well, I have a very jaded view of media, okay? And here's the other part. That's across the globe. I mean, it's a long ways from where you and I live. So but it's happening. There are still people, men, women, and children, who are being murdered because of their faith. Okay. Paul talks about persecutions and sufferings. You can suffer for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons is because you make dumb choices, and there are consequences to dumb choices. Usually, they involve suffering. But that's not what Paul's talking about. He's talking about sufferings that are connected to the persecution. And then he talks about 3 specific towns, Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. All 3 of those towns had Christians, believers, the church present. Iconium and Lystra, he picked up Timothy there. Timothy would have known. He may have been an observer of when Paul was stoned in Iconium and left for dead. That's not, I couldn't get what I wanted at the market, or they wouldn't let me join the club, or no. Stoned and left for dead. I mean, we have no idea, generally, what stoning was like. Stoning in century 1 was a very common punishment, especially for Jews. Nose is running. Allergies are driving me nuts. Okay. My apologies. The Old Testament, the law, prescribes stoning as a punishment for a number of different crimes and violations. But it was done in a almost sadistic fashion. What they wanted to do by stoning was end your life, but by 1,000 cuts. They didn't want you to die quickly. They wanted you to die slowly and suffer the agony of being, and we're not talking rocks, we're talking stones, heavy, big stones that were hurled at you. When Paul was stoned and dragged out of the city and left for dead, he would have not been just lying there, immobile. He would have been bleeding. I sincerely believe maybe it's entirely reasonable to believe that among his injuries would have been a concussion. It's real possible he had several lumps and gashes, and who knows. But the rest of his body would have been covered in blood and bruised. It would have been a gruesome picture. Timothy may have seen it. He may have witnessed it. This is a very ironic thing in this way. Years earlier, decades earlier, Paul had been an observer and a proponent of the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr. He had held the coats of the men who stoned him. And by the way, there's a reason why they didn't want their coats on, because they couldn't hurl the stones well while wearing their cloak. And so Paul held it and watched as Stephen was effectively murdered by a Jewish mob. I don't know if that ever ran through Paul's mind as he was being stoned in Iconium, but might have. Anyway, he cites the kinds of things that happened to him in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. And by the way, those cities are today in modern Turkey. The persecutions I endured. Okay. What are you supposed to do with persecutions? Endure them. Oh, I hate that. I would much prefer that in persecution I could somehow get out of Dodge or maybe even fight back. Paul just endured. We live in a culture, I said it before and I'll say it again, we live in a culture where endurance is just almost nowhere to be seen. And I mean this, I really don't intend to be political, but I will say there are a lot of churches who have no idea how to endure. What they do is they complain and whine and blame. Paul didn't seem to do that here. That doesn't seem to be part of Paul's enduring the persecutions. Well, here's the other side of that coin. When you're persecuted, endure. And then now the other side is, he goes on in verse 11, yet the Lord rescued me from all of them. Okay, now, I'm telling you, that this is biographical. I want to be rescued before the persecution. Paul was rescued after the persecution. Because I think what he means is, I endured the persecution, and yet the Lord rescued me from all of them, meaning it wasn't terminal. God saved my life. But he didn't do that to keep me from being persecuted. That is so much what I want, okay? I want you to rescue me, God, from the persecution and, frankly, inconvenience, uncertainty, frustration. Well, simple challenge and lesson from what we've looked at today. You endure persecution. God's promise has nothing to do with rescuing you before the persecution. Paul's life was full of being rescued, sometimes during the persecution and often after. Me figuring out God's time frame for this is really hard, and he seems to have little concern, maybe none, about what would be nice for me. Well, pick it up again next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.